It's hard enough to cope with my father-in-law's passing, but what my husband Bob said next left me speechless. Let's get divorced now that I've got the inheritance. I don't need an ATM like you anymore. For a moment, I couldn't process his words. What do you mean? I asked. Bob grinned smugly. I got about $1 million from my dad's inheritance, so I don't need you anymore. He then unleashed his frustrations. Do you know how embarrassed I've been? I had high hopes because my dad arranged this marriage, but I was disappointed to see such a plain woman like you. Then why did you marry me? You could have just said no. Isn't it obvious? For the money. Who'd marry someone like you otherwise? I couldn't stay silent after that. Fine, here's the divorce papers. I decided to agree to the divorce without revealing something important. I hope he regrets this later. My name is Catherine Smith, and I'm 42 years old. I run a fashion company. I got married to Bob, who's 2 years younger 2 years ago. Our marriage was arranged. Bob is the son of Mr. Smith, the CEO of a company I had been dealing with for many years. Being an only child, it seemed Mr. Smith initially intended for Bob to succeed him, but Bob showed no interest, nor was he particularly skilled at his job. So Bob quickly dropped out of the running for successor and just worked as a regular employee. What attracted me to Bob? His laid-back nature. Since childhood, people often told me I was too serious and lacked spontaneity. I was often praised for being studious, but sometimes people found me too stiff. Some of my ex-boyfriends even told me, "You're not fun. It's like I'm dating a boss." It was heartbreaking, but I always felt maybe I was too serious. Being labeled as inflexible was a common occurrence. I struggled with handling things casually and often got too engrossed. To me, Bob seemed like he was from a completely different world. Oh, the place is closed today. During our first date, Bob took me to a restaurant he recommended, but it was closed. Now I would have been flustered by such an unexpected situation, but not Bob. Let's just go to that diner over there. He changed plans effortlessly. For someone as rigid as me, his response was a revelation. I thought by being with him, I could also become adaptable. That's why I decided to marry him. Many people were against our marriage. Some even suggested I could find someone better. Even Mr. Smith, my father-in-law, wasn't very enthusiastic. You sure you want to take on my son? It feels like I'm burdening you with him, he had asked. Back then, I felt no one really understood Bob's worth. But maybe they were right. Soon after we got married, Bob quit his job without consulting anyone. He just stopped going to work. When both I and Mr. Smith inquired about the reason, Bob nonchalantly said, "Wait, why do I need to work if you are making money for us both?" My father-in-law and I were so taken aback by this that we were at a loss for words. Why would he rely solely on me for income? I tried to persuade Bob multiple times afterward with my father-in-law, but Bob's mindset never changed. After all, even if I work, I can't make as much as Catherine does. I was tempted to divorce Bob right after our marriage when he boldly declared he'd be a freeloader. If he was a young man in his 20s, I might have found this cute, but this tantrum was coming from a man approaching 40. In the end, we begrudgingly agreed that he'd do the household chores. Bob's parents had divorced a few years earlier. Apparently, before the divorce, Bob's mother wasn't particularly good at housework. She couldn't do anything, so I never learned anything from her. It seemed like Bob was making excuses, blaming his mother for his lack of domestic skills. True to his word at first, Bob was clueless about housework, but with persistent praise and guidance, he managed to handle basic tasks. However, that doesn't mean he became exceptionally good at it. Still, he looked quite satisfied with himself. Thanks to me taking care of the house, Catherine can work. You should be grateful." There was something about Bob's confident expression that rubbed me the wrong way, but it wasn't worth making a fuss about. "Yes, Bob, I'm really grateful for your help," I said, forcing a smile. There were times I got irritated, but I think we managed to get along quite well. About a year into our marriage, a significant event occurred. My father-in-law adopted a child, a 9-year-old boy named Jack. Jack seemed like any ordinary boy. My father-in-law is the type of person who doesn't make senseless decisions, so why did he suddenly adopt Jack? One day, when we were alone, I asked him. He replied, "Promise you won't tell anyone," and then explained. It turns out Jack was the child of an employee whom my father-in-law had been fond of. Having had a close relationship with the family, my father-in-law cared for Jack like a grandson. Tragically, a while back, Jack's parents died in an accident. Jack's parents had eloped, and he had no close relatives to rely on. Otherwise, he would have ended up in a foster home. While my father-in-law wasn't sure if Jack would be happy with us, he decided to adopt him, hoping it'd be for the best. I see, that's very kind of you. Although Bob and I didn't have children, we had quite a bit of freedom. Please rely on me if you need anything. Upon hearing this, my father-in-law smiled warmly. After that, thankfully, my father-in-law relied on me from time to time, just as I had asked. On nights when he absolutely couldn't make it back from work or when he had pressing commitments, I took care of Jack. At first, Jack was a bit apprehensive, but he warmed up quickly. He's either very friendly or trying hard to fit in. Thinking about it made me feel somewhat emotional. Bob, on the other hand, wasn't thrilled about the situation. It seemed he wasn't exactly welcoming toward Jack. I could understand his mixed feelings, knowing his father took in a stranger, but when I tried talking to Bob, it turned out he had a completely different concern. Adopting him? What's he thinking? This is going to cut into my inheritance. I was hoping to get everything. I couldn't believe my ears. Bob wasn't feeling conflicted about Jack. He was worried about the inheritance. "I'm going to talk to Dad about this. I'm not cool with it." One day Bob said this and went to confront his father. When he returned after a while, to my surprise, he was in a strangely good mood. I cautiously asked a smiling Bob, "How did it go?" He replied, "Oh, it's all good. My share isn't changing." "Huh, what do you mean? I always thought that even an adopted child like Jack had the same inheritance rights as a biological child. What's going on here?" Noticing my confusion, Bob smugly explained, "Dad's making Jack give up his inheritance rights. Makes sense, I'm his only son after all." Could the father-in-law who spoke of Jack with such affection really plan on leaving him nothing after his passing? Something didn't sit right with me. I wasn't convinced, but Bob said with relief, "I'm glad. Well, if my father-in-law says so, there must be a reason behind it. Either way, he is still in his 60s. We probably won't be dealing with any inheritance for a while. In fact, it seems more likely that I divorce Bob before my father-in-law passes away." I was nonchalantly pondering such thoughts. However, that moment came much sooner than expected. A year later, my father-in-law was involved in an accident and never came back. I never thought I'd say goodbye to him so soon. I've known my father-in-law longer than I've known Bob. He was a respectable man, both in his professional and private life. After hearing the news, I was overcome with a sense of loss, and tears wouldn't stop flowing. My eyes heavy from crying and my head throbbing, I forced myself to prepare for the funeral. Bob was the main mourner, but he didn't seem to be grieving. He just seemed distant. His father had passed away so suddenly. Perhaps Bob was in such shock that it didn't feel real. I had to step up and make preparations to bid farewell to my father-in-law on behalf of Bob. I felt like crying, but somehow held back during the funeral. As hard as it was for me, seeing Jack cry was the most heartbreaking. Throughout it all, Bob didn't shed a single tear. That's when I began to find his behavior peculiar. Rather than grieving, Bob seemed restless or even giddy. Some time after the commotion, the reason became clear. "Bob, isn't something off with you? Aren't you sad about your dad's passing?" I intended my comment to reflect concern about his lack of tears, but his response caught me off guard. "Oh, of course I'm sad, but I'm also kind of thrilled. Oops, guess my joy showed, huh? Come on, Catherine, Dad was the CEO, right? He's bound to have some money. How much do you think he left behind?" Geez, how awful could this be? I had thought Bob was just zoning out, but from before the funeral up to now, he hadn't been mourning his father at all, but grinning thinking about the inheritance. "What on earth are you thinking?" "Well, think about it. We're divorced and my mom doesn't have any of it. I'm his only blood child. Jack, being adopted, won't inherit anything, so all the inheritance is mine. You think I can't be thrilled about that?" Bob had a face that looked like he was about to burst into laughter any moment. Seeing that face made me feel like I was going to slap him. That's how much Bob's face had relaxed. He was truly delighted from the bottom of his heart that my stepfather had passed away. "I can't believe it. Say whatever you want." I just wanted to leave right then, but before that, there was something I had to tell Bob about Jack. Now that my stepfather's gone, I've temporarily asked Bob to keep Jack at our place, but if things continue like this, Jack will have to go to a foster home. In that case, I want to raise Jack with my own hands. That's what I was thinking about. Jack: "Yeah, you're going to take him in? Sounds good to me." I was surprised by how easily Bob agreed, and he continued with a smile. "After all, what you do, Catherine, has absolutely nothing to do with me anymore." Then he held up a single piece of paper to me. It was a green paper, a divorce paper. "What's this?" Confused, I asked, and Bob crisply replied, "Let's get a divorce. Now that I've got the inheritance, I don't need my personal ATM. You anymore." For a moment, I didn't understand what Bob was saying. Did he just call me an ATM and even say I'm no longer needed? "What do you mean?" When I asked, Bob smirked and proudly told me, "I got around $1 million from my dad's inheritance, so I don't need you anymore." Bob continued, "With this much, I don't have to work anymore. I don't need to please you. I don't have to bother with tedious chores. Oh, how wonderful." With exaggerated gestures, Bob openly expressed his joy. I was deeply shocked seeing this side of Bob. The inheritance was money that came in after my stepfather's death, yet he's rejoicing as if he won the lottery. As I've been feeling, Bob doesn't seem to mourn or remember my stepfather. He's genuinely happy, but money is a scary thing. It's not uncommon for people to change dramatically after getting a huge sum. Perhaps with such a large amount in front of him, Bob's just getting a bit carried away. "Calm down, Bob. Look, let's talk first." I put my hand on Bob's shoulder, but Bob quickly shrugged it off and shouted at me with fury, "Shut up, you boring woman. I married you because you were introduced by my father, and you were a CEO, but I always felt suffocated with you. It's hard for me." Bob listed his grievances against me. I was so disappointed when I expected someone better from the arranged date my dad set up, but then got someone plain like you. If that's the case, he could have just refused the match. I never forced him or passionately persuaded him to marry me. Being portrayed as the victim didn't sit right with me. "So why did you marry me then? If you had declined, that would have been fine." "It's obvious, for the money. Who else would marry someone like you?" Bob laughed at me, mocking. "Basically, he married me for my wealth. Bob started with, "It's been a while, so I guess it's safe to say," and revealed a shocking fact. I had a significant debt. My dad said if I changed my ways and devoted myself to you, he would pay it off. So, of course, I would marry you. It meant he never loved me. He just married me for the money. Well, it wasn't fun, but thanks to you, I was saved. Thanks a lot. Seeing Bob laughing crudely, I made up my mind. I don't know this man anymore. I decided not to give him the advice I had planned on and just started filling out the divorce papers without hesitation. I wrote without pausing or second-guessing. Bob, who had been urging the divorce, seemed a bit surprised to see this. "Hey, are you thinking of getting a divorce now?" "Fine. Here's the divorce papers." After writing them, I felt a sense of accomplishment. Now we're total strangers. Yeah, whatever happens now doesn't concern the other. You can live with that kid, Jack, and I can hang out with younger women. We're free. Bob was ecstatic. From what I could see, he hadn't cheated during our marriage. I never suspected it, but that was a point of interest. But Bob, if you were this happy about it, you should have divorced sooner. I had my reasons. I wanted the money. Bob carelessly stuffed the divorce papers into his bag and left the house in a hurry. I didn't feel right staying in the house where I'd lived with Bob. I was thinking of starting fresh somewhere new with Jack. This seemed like a good time to sell the house and move. I'd love to live close to my parents' place. I think it would help both Jack and me. Jack will have to transfer schools, but he said that's okay. It's a bit sad, but now we can look for a new place without any reservations. Finding a new place was a bit of a challenge, but after some thought, I made a choice. The main deciding factors were the short distance to my parents and the great location. It's pricey, but considering Jack, I think it's the best property out there. Jack accompanied me to view the property, and his eyes lit up at the sight of the luxurious house. It's spacious and elaborately decorated. There's plenty of storage, which was a concern of mine, and surprisingly, it even came with a pool. Honestly, I didn't need a pool, but seeing Jack's excitement made it worth it. Wow, this is amazing. It would have been fine for me to live anywhere, but seeing him happy was what mattered most. And so we moved. It took a while for both Jack and me to adjust, but eventually, our new house became a comforting place. Around that time, I got a call from Bob. He seemed desperate and said he wanted to meet and apologize. Immediately, I had an idea why he'd suddenly say that. I could have ignored him, but since he was so insistent, I decided to meet. I left Jack with my mother and headed to the diner I had specified. Bob had arrived earlier. He was sitting in a corner booth, looking pale and on the verge of tears. "Catherine," I gave Bob a cold look as he stood up upon seeing me. "What do you want, Bob? We're supposed to be strangers now." "Don't say that. The truth is my dad had debts. Damn, I never thought he'd." "So what? You inherited $1 million, right? Just pay it off." No, the debts, they're more than the inheritance. It seemed the debt exceeded the $1 million inheritance. So after inheriting both the assets and the liabilities, Bob was now saddled with debt. I didn't know I'd inherit the debt too. Bob looked defeated. "Please, Catherine, you must have some savings. We were married once. Please help me out." He pleaded with a flattering smile. Did Bob even remember what he said before? "After all the times you belittled me, even calling me an ATM who would want to help you now?" It was audacious of him to contact me. He'd said over the phone that he wanted to apologize, but he hasn't done so yet. "You really regretted our marriage, didn't you? After everything you said, how can you ask for help now?" Well, back then, I never imagined this would happen. His convenience astounded me. He probably thought he wouldn't need money from me anymore, but now that he does, he's groveling. It seemed that way. "Sorry, but I can't meet your expectations. I don't have the money." "What are you talking about? I know your business is thriving." "Liar. I wish he'd stop blaming me, an innocent bystander, for his own mistakes. I'm not lying. I just don't have the money to lend to you. Not every bank lends to everyone, right? Why would I lend if I don't expect it back? Bob remembered the harsh words he once threw at me and looked a bit guilty, yet he doesn't apologize. Such a proud man. What's with the cold shoulder? Don't you care what happens to me? Oh, did you forget what you said when we got divorced? We're strangers now, nothing to do with each other. Weren't those your words? I don't understand how he can act like he's the victim. How thick-skinned can he be? Does he have the ability to forget everything that doesn't suit him? I wish I had recorded what he said back then and could play it back to him. I might have said something like that, but I didn't mean it. I never imagined things would turn out this way. Bob leaned on the table, looking sad. I thought about the life insurance, but my dad's lawyer said I'm not the beneficiary. Oh, really? I laughed at his statement, which made Bob look at me in shock. You don't think, Catherine, did my dad leave it to you? No, it's not me. Then why'd you laugh? Just felt a bit sorry for you, that's all. If it was insurance, I wouldn't have inherited the debt. Exactly. That's why my father-in-law had Jack renounce the inheritance. He had left something for Jack in the form of life insurance. The beneficiary of my father-in-law's life insurance was Jack. Is that all you wanted to talk about? If so, I'm leaving. There's nothing I can do for you. Wait, can't we start over? I was just upset about my dad back then, but I truly care about you, Catherine. You mean you only see me as a dollar sign, right? I know Bob was denying and saying all sorts of things, but I'm not getting fooled again. After all, I don't have a single dime to give to someone like him. Well, someone important is waiting for me at home. With that, I left the diner. I could hear Bob crying out in a pitiful manner, but to me it was just noise. I need to hurry home. Jack might be hungry, or maybe he got something from his grandma. I quickly headed to the subway station. As for Bob, I heard he's working multiple part-time jobs to pay off his debts. With no work experience, qualifications, or motivation, he couldn't get a full-time job anywhere. I once saw him working at a convenience store while I was on my way to a client. He looked much older and thinner, quite shocking. Bob, who had been living off others, was now facing the consequences. There's no sympathy for him. On the other hand, I'm living peacefully with Jack. We even argue sometimes now. It's saddening when Jack ignores me after a fight, but I try to see it as a sign that he's opening up to me. I plan to support him until he can stand on his own 2 feet. That's probably what my father-in-law wished for, and it's my goal in life now.
As I watched my belongings alongside Lucas's thrown out like yesterday's trash, Daniel's words echoed with chilling finality. If you don't like it, leave. Standing there, with our son's hand in mine, I knew this was no longer just about a failing marriage. It was about fighting back for our dignity. I am Evelyn Marshall, a 32-year-old working mother, navigating the complexities of what once was a happy marriage. Now, I stand at the crossroads of a life that seems to be unraveling at the seams. It's a story I never thought I'd tell, but here I am, reflecting on the journey that led me to this moment. My life, contrary to the turbulence now, began in a rather privileged manner. I was born into an affluent family, blessed with the comforts that wealth could bring. Yet, with a spirit yearning for independence, I chose to carve out my own path, determined to earn my living and not just rely on the legacy of my lineage. This decision, while empowering, set the stage for a series of events that would later challenge my very essence. Daniel and I met at the company where we both worked. He was there first, a man of charm and ambition. Our initial days were like pages from a fairy tale, filled with laughter, shared dreams, and a love that seemed to defy all odds. Our courtship was a whirlwind, and marriage felt like a natural progression, a testament to our love. Little did I know, it was also the beginning of a slow, simmering discord. You see, despite our shared workplace, our careers took different trajectories. I, perhaps due to my upbringing or sheer drive, ascended the corporate ladder more swiftly than Daniel. This disparity, insignificant in my eyes, began to fester in his. While dating, it was a non-issue, even a source of pride for him. But marriage changed the unspoken dynamics. The man who once celebrated my achievements started viewing them as a mirror reflecting his perceived inadequacies. When Lucas, our son, came into our lives, I thought it would bring us closer, solidify our bond. I took maternity leave, embracing motherhood with all its joys and challenges. Daniel's behavior, however, took a turn that I hadn't anticipated. His comments, initially subtle, grew increasingly bitter. "Must be nice to get money without working," he'd say, his words laced with a disdain that cut through me. The financial support I appreciated turned into a tool for asserting dominance, a way to remind me of my supposed dependence during my leave. The workplace wasn't spared either. Being his superior on professional grounds, I had to maintain a delicate balance between being his wife and his boss. I endeavored to keep our work and personal lives separate, but the lines blurred, the tension palpable. Daniel's pride seemed wounded, not just by my professional stature, but by his perception that his own worth was diminished in comparison. In the midst of this growing estrangement, there was another factor, steadily poisoning the remnants of our marriage. Margaret, Daniel's mother. She was a formidable presence in our lives, casting a long shadow over our marriage. A woman of strong opinions and traditional beliefs, she saw my career achievements not as a matter of pride, but as a transgression of the roles she believed a wife should play. Her words were sharp, often loaded with a disdain for the modern woman I represented. "Daniel should be the one leading," she would often say, a sneer barely concealed. "A woman's place isn't above her husband." Her words, echoing through our home, only fueled Daniel's growing insecurities. It was as if my success was an indictment of his perceived shortcomings, and Margaret was the judge who passed the verdict. As Daniel's resentment simmered, our home life became strained. He started distancing himself from both Lucas and me. Where there was once laughter and shared moments, there now existed a cold, uncomfortable silence. I watched helplessly as the man I loved transformed into a stranger, his warmth replaced by a bitterness that seemed to stem from a deep well of dissatisfaction and hurt pride. Even as I tried to reach out to bridge the growing chasm between us, Daniel retreated further, often seeking refuge in his mother's company. Margaret's influence became more pronounced, her criticism of my role as a wife and mother growing more frequent and biting. "Leaving such a small child and going to work?" she would chide. "Don't you have any maternal feelings?" Her words stung, but what pained me most was the impact on Lucas. Our son, bright and perceptive, began to sense the tension, the undercurrents of discord that flowed beneath the surface of our family life. He stopped talking about his father and grandmother, his young mind perhaps unable to articulate the confusion and hurt he felt. In stark contrast, my parents provided a haven of unconditional love and support for Lucas. They adored him, filling his world with the affection and attention he so desperately needed. Their home became his refuge, a place where he could be a carefree child, away from the complexities clouding our own home. As I watched Lucas thrive in their presence, a thought began to take root in my mind. The environment at home, the constant tension and coldness, was not wanted for my son. The idea of leaving, once unthinkable, started to seem like a viable, even necessary option. But I was torn, caught between my commitment to my marriage and the well-being of my son. It was in the midst of this turmoil, as I grappled with the decision that lay ahead, that something decisive happened, something that would change the course of our lives forever. The day that altered everything began like any other, but it ended leaving my world in shambles. I returned home from work to find the unthinkable. My belongings, along with Lucas's, were strewn across our yard, discarded like refuse. My heart pounded with a mix of shock and disbelief as I stared at the chaotic scene before me. There, standing with an air of triumph, were Daniel and Margaret. The disdain in their eyes was unmistakable. Daniel's words hit me like a physical blow. "Since Mom's moving in, we've cleared out your stuff. If you don't like it, leave." His voice was cold, devoid of the warmth I once knew. Margaret's sneer was equally cutting, We don't need a wife who doesn't care for her husband. Take your unattractive grandson and leave. Their words, cruel and unforgiving, echoed in my ears. But amidst the hurt and the shock, a sense of clarity began to emerge. This was not just an attack on me, but on our innocent son, who stood beside me, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. The realization hit me hard. This was no longer the family or the home I once cherished. It was time to leave. With a heavy heart but a resolute mind, I gathered our belongings, my hands trembling with a mix of rage and sorrow. Lucas, still too young to fully grasp the situation, helped quietly, his usual chatter replaced by a somber silence. As I packed, a memory surfaced, a detail about our house that I had almost forgotten. A lease agreement, with a clause that could turn the tables in our favor. But in that moment, I chose to remain silent. Let them believe they had won, for now. My focus was on getting Lucas away from this toxic environment. "We're leaving," I said finally, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Daniel and Margaret looked at each other, smug satisfaction in their eyes. Little did they know, this was not the end, but the beginning of my fight back. With Lucas in tow, I left the house that was no longer a home. The drive to my parents' house was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. As we pulled up, the warm glow from the windows offered a stark contrast to the coldness we had left behind. In that moment, I knew I had made the right decision. We were safe, we were loved, and most importantly, we were free from the bitterness and cruelty that had overshadowed our lives. The sanctuary of my parents' home felt like a balm to our bruised hearts. Their shock at our sudden arrival quickly gave way to an unwavering support that enveloped Lucas and me. In their embrace, I found the strength that I feared had been drained by the events at our former home. Lucas, ever resilient, adapted quickly to our new reality. The bond he shared with my parents was a joy to behold, their unconditional love filling the void left by his father's abandonment. Watching him play and laugh in their care, I felt a pang of regret for not having made this move sooner. His happiness was a stark reminder of what he had been missing. In the quiet of my old room, now our temporary haven, I contemplated our future. The decision to divorce Daniel became not just a necessity, but a resolve to protect Lucas and myself from further harm. My mind was set. I would ensure that Lucas would never again have to witness the kind of hostility we had experienced. The following days were a blur of activity. Meeting with a lawyer, a longtime acquaintance of my family, I laid out the details of my situation. He listened intently, his expression a mix of professional detachment and personal concern. We discussed the logistics of divorce, custody arrangements, child support, and the division of assets. While I was financially secure, thanks to my earnings and inheritance, I was adamant that Daniel should bear responsibility for his son. Returning to the house to collect the rest of our belongings was a surreal experience. The place that had once been filled with laughter and love now stood empty and silent, a shell of its former self. Lucas clung to my side, his small hand gripping mine tightly as we packed up the remnants of our life there. As we left, I took one last look at the house. It was more than just a building. It was a symbol of a life that could have been. But as I turned away, I felt a sense of liberation. The ties that had bound me to that place, to a life filled with discord and unhappiness, were now severed. With each passing day, the initial shock and pain gave way to a sense of hope and anticipation for the future. Lucas's laughter became the soundtrack of our days, and in his smiles, I found the motivation to rebuild our lives. We were starting over, but this time we were doing it on our own terms. The journey through the legal landscape of divorce was like navigating a stormy sea. My lawyer, seasoned in the ebbs and flows of such proceedings, was a guiding light. The primary focus was securing a fair arrangement for child support. While my financial situation was stable, I insisted that Daniel uphold his responsibilities as Lucas's father. The day we presented the divorce papers to Daniel was charged with tension. His reaction to the child support clause was a mix of disbelief and anger. "Child support? After all the embarrassment you've caused me?" he blustered, his voice a mix of indignation and shock. Margaret, ever the antagonist, chimed in with her usual venom. "Why should John pay a dime to this ungrateful woman?" Despite their outbursts, I remained resolute, my lawyer calmly explaining the legal obligations and the fairness of the proposed amount. Daniel's frustration was evident, but the realization that his professional reputation could be at stake if he defaulted on his responsibilities seemed to temper his defiance. As we finalized the divorce proceedings, I couldn't help but reflect on the irony of it all. Here was Daniel, the man I had once pledged my life to, now a virtual stranger, bound to me only by the legalities of our shared past and our son. In those moments, a range of emotions washed over me. Relief that I was breaking free from a toxic relationship, sorrow for the love that had once been, and a fierce determination to build a better future for Lucas and me. The divorce marked the end of a chapter in my life, but it also signified the start of a new beginning. As I walked out of the lawyer's office, divorce papers in hand, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was the first step towards reclaiming my life and providing Lucas with the stable, loving environment he deserved. With the legal battles behind us, I turned my focus to rebuilding our lives. The support of my parents was invaluable, their love and encouragement a constant source of strength. Lucas thrived in their care, his laughter and playful antics a daily reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. As we settled into our new reality, I found myself looking forward to the future with a sense of hope and optimism. The path ahead was uncertain, but I was determined to walk it with grace and strength for myself and for my son. The days following the divorce were a blend of relief and rebuilding. But amidst this new beginning, a revelation awaited. A twist in our tale that I had kept close to my chest. The house, the battleground of our final conflict, held a secret that was about to turn the tide in my favor. It began with an innocuous phone call from Daniel, now more a stranger than ever. His voice, laced with confusion and anger, pierced through the speaker. "Evelyn, what's this about an eviction notice? Why is it in your name?" I remember pausing for a moment, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. This was it, the moment I had anticipated. "Daniel, the lease needs renewal, and I've decided not to," I replied calmly. The silence on the other end was palpable, as the realization dawned on him. "Yes, Daniel, the house is mine," I continued, the words tasting of both victory and sorrow. "It's part of the properties under my name, inherited from my family." The shock in his voice was evident as he processed the news. All this time, the house he believed to be ours was, in fact, a part of my heritage. The conversation that followed was a mix of disbelief, anger, and desperation. Daniel's tone shifted from accusatory to pleading, as the full extent of his situation became clear. Without the house, he and Margaret were, in essence, homeless. But my decision was firm. The house, a symbol of a past life, needed to be let go, just as I had let go of the relationship. "You need to find somewhere else, Daniel. We're divorced now, and you're no longer my responsibility," I said, a mix of sadness and resolve in my voice. The call ended with Daniel's protest still ringing in my ears, but I knew I had made the right decision. It was not just about the house or the divorce. It was about setting boundaries, about asserting my independence from a relationship that had become toxic. As days turned into weeks, I watched as Daniel and Margaret struggled to find a new place. There was a part of me that felt for their plight, but another part reminded me of the necessity of this harsh lesson. They had to understand that actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences are irrevocable. Meanwhile, life for Lucas and me was taking a turn for the better. Our small apartment near my parents' house became a haven of peace and stability. Lucas's laughter filled the rooms, a sound that had become my favorite melody. In those moments, watching him play or listening to his endless stories, I knew that no matter the challenges, we would be all right. In the weeks that followed the eviction notice, the reality of their new circumstances began to dawn on Daniel and Margaret. They had been complacent, perhaps assuming that the comfort and stability they enjoyed were unchanging. But now, faced with the immediate need to find a new living situation, their world was thrown into disarray. For Daniel, the challenges were manifold. Not only had he lost his home, but also the stability and support he had taken for granted. His pride, already bruised from the divorce, took another hit as he struggled to come to terms with the consequences of his actions. Margaret, too, faced a harsh awakening. The vision she had of living comfortably with her son, free from the responsibilities she so despised, was shattered. The prospect of finding a new place, especially under strained financial conditions, was daunting. As for me, the aftermath of the divorce and eviction brought a sense of closure. While it was painful to witness their struggles, it also served as a reminder of the importance of self-respect and setting boundaries in relationships. It was a lesson in taking control of one's life, no matter how difficult the choices might be. Meanwhile, Lucas and I settled into our new routine. Our apartment, though smaller than the house we had left behind, was filled with love and laughter. Lucas thrived in this new environment, his resilience a constant source of amazement and pride for me. Our days were filled with simple joys, walks in the park, visits to the library, and evenings spent with my parents, who continued to be a pillar of support. In those moments, surrounded by the people who truly mattered, I found a contentment that had been missing for so long. The experience also taught me the value of looking forward, of not letting the past dictate the future. I began to focus on rebuilding my life, not just for myself, but for Lucas. He deserved a mother who was strong, happy, and present, and I was determined to be just that. The challenges we faced had not only tested our strength, but had also brought us closer. Our bond, forged in adversity, was now unbreakable. And as I looked at Lucas, growing and flourishing despite everything, I knew that no matter what lay ahead, we would face it together, with love and courage. The dawn of our new life brought with it a sense of renewal and hope. Each day, as I watched Lucas grow and thrive, I was reminded of the resilience of the human spirit. Our small apartment, filled with laughter and love, was a testament to our journey and the strength we had found in each other. Lucas's happiness was my guiding light. His inquisitive eyes, so full of wonder and joy, were a constant reminder of the innocence and purity that life still held. I found myself cherishing the simple moments, his excited chatter about his day at school, the quiet evenings spent reading together, and the weekends exploring the city with my parents. These were the moments that mattered, the memories that would shape his childhood. Professionally, I found a new sense of purpose and fulfillment. With the personal turmoil behind me, I was able to focus on my career with renewed vigor. My achievements, no longer overshadowed by the complexities of my personal life, became sources of pride and satisfaction. As I navigated my new reality, I also learned the importance of self-care and self-love. I found solace in small acts of kindness towards myself, a quiet evening with a book, a leisurely walk in the park, or a coffee date with a friend. These moments of solitude and reflection were crucial in rediscovering myself, in understanding who I was beyond the roles of mother and professional. Most importantly, I became acutely aware of the impact of relationships on one's life. The support and love of my parents, the unwavering bond with Lucas, and the solidarity of friends who stood by me through the darkest times were my pillars of strength. They taught me the value of genuine connections, of surrounding oneself with people who uplift and inspire. As for Daniel, our paths rarely crossed, except for the occasional formalities regarding Lucas. The bitterness that once marred our interactions had given way to a detached civility. While the love we once shared was lost, I held no ill will. Instead, I chose to focus on the present and the future, on the life I was building for myself and my son. In the end, the journey I had embarked on, fraught with challenges and heartaches, led me to a place of peace and contentment. It was a journey of self-discovery, of learning that strength sometimes lies in letting go, and that true happiness comes from within. As I watched Lucas play, his laughter ringing through our home, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons learned, for the love received, and for the new beginnings that lay ahead. Our story was one of triumph, not just over the circumstances we faced, but over the doubts and fears that once held us back. And so, we moved forward hand in hand, ready to embrace whatever the future held, with love, hope, and an unwavering faith in the journey of life.